Captain James Morrison had served the royal family for 15 years. His loyalty was unquestionable, his record spotless. Every morning, he walked the same route through Buckingham Palace, checking security, greeting staff, and ensuring everything ran smoothly. But this particular Tuesday morning felt different. As James made his rounds through the East Wing, he noticed something unusual. Queen Camilla's private secretary, Margaret Thornfield, was having a hushed conversation with someone James didn't recognize. The man wore an expensive suit but carried himself like someone who dealt in secrets rather than state business. James pretended to examine a painting while listening carefully. He caught fragments of their conversation that made his blood run cold. "The king's schedule needs to be adjusted," Margaret whispered urgently. "The doctor's appointment on Thursday must be moved to Wednesday. Everything depends on the timing." The stranger nodded grimly. "Our contact at the hospital is ready. Once the king arrives for his routine checkup, the switch will happen. The medical reports will show exactly what we need them to show." James felt his heart pounding. Medical reports? What switch? He had been responsible for the king's security detail many times and knew that His Majesty had been feeling unwell lately. The king had mentioned having some routine tests done. Nothing serious. But this conversation suggested something far more sinister. "What about the other family members?" the stranger asked. Margaret glanced around nervously before answering. "Prince William and Catherine are away on their tour of Australia. Prince Harry is in California. The timing couldn't be better. By the time anyone realizes what's happening, it will be too late." James moved closer, pretending to adjust a flower arrangement. The stranger continued speaking in low tones. "The Queen has been very clear about her expectations. Once the medical crisis begins, she'll need to step forward as regent. The paperwork is already prepared. Constitutional lawyers have reviewed everything. It's all perfectly legal. And the king?" Margaret asked quietly. "The king will be in no condition to object. The doctors will recommend complete rest, possibly at a private facility, away from the stress of royal duties, of course." James felt sick to his stomach. They were planning to remove King Charles from power using false medical reports. This wasn't just treachery. It was a carefully planned coup disguised as concern for the monarch's health. The stranger handed Margaret a thick envelope. "Everything you need is in there. The altered test results, the doctor's recommendations, even the press statements explaining why the Queen must take over royal duties temporarily." "Your mistress has thought of everything." Margaret tucked the envelope into her handbag. "She's been planning this for months. Ever since the king started talking about modernizing the monarchy and reducing the number of working royals. She believes she can do a better job leading the family. Power has a way of corrupting people," the stranger said with a cold smile. "Even queens." James watched as they shook hands and parted ways. Margaret headed toward Queen Camilla's private apartments while the stranger disappeared through a side exit. James knew he had to act quickly, but he also understood the gravity of what he had discovered. Accusing the Queen of plotting against her own husband would require absolute proof. He followed Margaret at a distance, watching as she entered Camilla's private study. Through a partially open door, James could hear voices inside. He positioned himself behind a large pillar where he could listen without being seen. "Is everything arranged?" came Queen Camilla's voice. Though it sounded different from her usual warm public tone, this voice was sharp, calculating. "Yes, Your Majesty. Dr. Harrison at the private clinic has agreed to alter the test results. The king's blood work will show elevated levels that suggest serious heart problems requiring immediate intervention." James couldn't believe what he was hearing. Queen Camilla was personally orchestrating a plot to have her husband declared medically unfit to rule. "And the constitutional experts?" Camilla asked. "They've confirmed that if the king is declared temporarily incapacitated, you can assume regent powers. Once you're in control, maintaining that position becomes much easier." "Excellent. Charles has become too progressive for his own good. All this talk about reducing the monarchy's footprint, cutting ceremonies, modernizing traditions. He doesn't understand that the people want grandeur, not efficiency." James realized this wasn't just about power. Queen Camilla genuinely believed she could be a better monarch than her husband. In her mind, she was saving the institution from Charles's reforms. "What about public opinion?" Margaret asked. "The public loves me," Camilla replied confidently. "I've worked hard to rehabilitate my image since marrying Charles. They'll accept my temporary leadership, especially if it's presented as necessary for the king's health." And temporary has a way of becoming permanent if managed correctly. James heard footsteps approaching the door. He quickly moved away, his mind racing with the implications of what he had learned. He needed evidence, real proof that would convince others of what was happening. But he also needed to protect the king without alerting the conspirators to his knowledge. As he walked back to his office, James considered his options. He could go directly to King Charles, but would the monarch believe such an incredible accusation against his own wife? He could contact other senior palace officials, but how many of them might already be involved in the plot? The weight of responsibility settled on James's shoulders. He was perhaps the only person in a position to stop this conspiracy, but he would need to be incredibly careful. One wrong move could not only destroy his career, but also allow the plot to succeed. James sat at his desk and began making notes, carefully documenting everything he had seen and heard. He would need to gather more evidence, identify all the conspirators, and find a way to warn the king without triggering the very crisis they were planning to fake. Time was running short. The king's medical appointment was scheduled for Thursday, but they planned to move it to Wednesday. That gave James less than 24 hours to uncover the full extent of the conspiracy and find a way to stop it. He looked out his window at the palace gardens where tourists gathered to catch glimpses of royal life. They had no idea that behind these walls, a struggle for the very future of the monarchy was about to begin. James Morrison, a simple captain of the guard, found himself standing at the center of the most significant crisis the royal family had faced in decades. The next morning, James arrived at work earlier than usual. He had spent most of the night planning his approach, and he knew today would be crucial. He needed more evidence before he could act, but he also had to be ready to move quickly if necessary. His first stop was the Palace Communications Center. James had built good relationships with the staff over the years, and he hoped someone might have noticed unusual activity. Sally Henderson, who managed the telephone systems, greeted him warmly. "Morning, Captain Morrison. You're here early today." "Sally, I need to ask you something confidential. Have you noticed any unusual phone calls lately? Particularly from Queen Camilla's office?" Sally looked around nervously before answering. "Actually, yes. Yesterday afternoon there were several calls to a private medical clinic. Not the usual royal physicians, but someplace called Harrington Private Health Services. Margaret Thornfield made at least 6 calls there." James felt his pulse quicken. "Did you happen to overhear any of these conversations?" "Well, I shouldn't have been listening, but Margaret was speaking quite loudly. She kept mentioning something about Wednesday appointments and special arrangements for a VIP patient. She also talked about discreet transport and private entrances." This confirmed what James had suspected. They were planning to take the king to a facility where they could control the medical evaluation completely. He thanked Sally and headed to his next destination. The palace archives were located in the basement, managed by an elderly clerk named Arthur Pemberton. Arthur had worked at the palace for 40 years and knew more about royal protocols than anyone else alive. "Arthur, I need to understand something about constitutional law. If the king were declared temporarily unfit for duty, what would be the exact process?" Arthur raised his eyebrows but answered professionally. "Well, it would require medical certification from at least 2 independent physicians, approval from the Privy Council, and formal documentation. The Queen Consort could potentially serve as regent, but there are strict procedures. How long would such an arrangement typically last? That would depend on the medical prognosis. Temporary could mean weeks, months, or even years. Once someone is declared unfit, reversing that decision becomes quite complex, especially if the regent is performing well in the role." James realized how clever Camilla's plan really was. By using legitimate constitutional processes, she could achieve an illegitimate goal. Once she became regent, she would control the very mechanisms needed to challenge her authority. He spent the next hour researching Harrington Private Health Services. Using the palace's secure internet connection, he discovered that the clinic was owned by a consortium of investors, including several companies linked to people who had business relationships with various royal charities. More importantly, Dr. Harrison, whom Margaret had mentioned, had been involved in several controversies regarding questionable medical assessments for wealthy clients. James was building a clear picture of the conspiracy, but he still needed to understand its full scope. He decided to take a significant risk and attempt to observe Queen Camilla's activities directly. Using his security clearance, James positioned himself in a maintenance corridor that ran behind Camilla's private apartments. The old palace had numerous hidden passages that staff used to move around without disturbing the royal family. Through a ventilation grate, he could hear conversations in Camilla's study. "The timing must be perfect," Camilla was saying to someone. "Charles's morning tea needs to contain the medication that will elevate his blood pressure and heart rate. Nothing dangerous, just enough to make him feel unwell." James heard Margaret's voice responding. "Dr. Harrison assures us that the synthetic compound will create symptoms consistent with cardiac stress, without causing permanent damage. The king will genuinely feel ill, which will make his cooperation with the medical examination more likely." "And the media strategy?" Camilla asked. A new voice answered, one James didn't recognize. "We have prepared statements expressing deep concern for His Majesty's health. The story will be that the Queen noticed concerning symptoms and insisted on immediate medical attention. Her quick action will be portrayed as potentially life-saving." James was horrified. They weren't just planning to fake medical results. They intended to actually drug the king to create genuine symptoms. This transformed their conspiracy from fraud into assault. "What about the staff?" Camilla inquired. "Charles's personal valet, his private secretary? They've been given extended leave," Margaret replied. "Officially, it's to allow His Majesty privacy during his health scare. Unofficially, it removes potential witnesses and obstacles." James realized that many of the king's most loyal staff members had been systematically removed from the palace over the past week. He had assumed it was normal scheduling, but now he understood it was part of the conspiracy. The conversation continued, revealing more details about their plan. After the king was taken to the private clinic, he would be kept sedated while fake test results were produced. The media would be told he was resting and recovering, but in reality, he would be a prisoner in his own medical care. "How long do we maintain the charade?" the unknown voice asked. "Until the public and the government become comfortable with my leadership," Camilla answered. 6 months should be sufficient. By then, Charles's absence will feel normal, and any attempt to restore him will seem disruptive." James had heard enough. He carefully made his way back to his office, his mind racing with the enormity of what he had discovered. This wasn't just about removing the king from power. It was about permanently altering the British monarchy. He checked his watch. It was already past noon, and the king's appointment had been moved to tomorrow morning. James had less than 18 hours to stop a conspiracy that had been months in the planning. His first instinct was to go directly to King Charles, but he knew that approach carried enormous risks. If the king didn't believe him, or if word of James's accusations reached Camilla, they might accelerate their timeline and act immediately. Instead, James decided to gather one final piece of evidence that would be impossible to dismiss. He needed to document the conspiracy in a way that would protect both himself and the king. Using his security access, James made his way to the palace's technical services department. He explained to the head technician that he needed to install additional monitoring equipment in the Queen's apartments for security purposes. This wasn't entirely unusual, as security measures were frequently updated. The technician helped James install several tiny recording devices in strategic locations. If James could capture Camilla explicitly discussing the plot, he would have irrefutable evidence of her treachery. As evening approached, James positioned himself where he could monitor the feeds from the recording devices. Around 8 o'clock, his patience was rewarded. Camilla was meeting with Margaret and 2 other people James didn't recognize. "Everything is set for tomorrow morning," one of the strangers was saying. "The medication will be administered with the king's breakfast tea at precisely 7:30. By 8:15, he should begin experiencing symptoms. By 9 o'clock, we'll have him at the clinic." "And Dr. Harrison is prepared?" Camilla asked. "Completely. The false test results are already prepared. Blood work showing dangerous cardiac markers, stress tests indicating immediate risk. His Majesty will be declared in need of complete rest and medical supervision." James watched as Camilla smiled coldly. "By this time tomorrow, I will be Queen Regent. Charles's progressive nonsense will be finished, and we can return the monarchy to its proper grandeur." The evidence was overwhelming. James now had recordings of Queen Camilla personally authorizing a conspiracy to drug and remove her husband from power, but he also realized that stopping this plot would require extreme measures and perfect timing. James spent the night developing his plan. He couldn't simply warn the king because Camilla would deny everything and possibly accelerate her timeline. He needed to catch the conspirators in the act while protecting His Majesty from harm. The solution he devised was risky but necessary. At 5:30 in the morning, James arrived at the palace kitchens. He had worked closely with the kitchen staff over the years, particularly during state dinners and official events. The head chef, Marie Dubois, was someone he trusted completely. "Marie, I need your help with something extremely serious," James began, explaining that he suspected someone was planning to tamper with the king's morning tea. He couldn't reveal the full conspiracy yet, but he emphasized the immediate danger. Marie was shocked but agreed to help. Together, they arranged for a substitute tea service to be prepared in secret. When Margaret Thornfield arrived at the kitchen to ensure the king's tea was properly prepared, Marie would give her the decoy service while the real tea was delivered through a different route. "But Captain Morrison," Marie whispered, "if someone is really planning to poison His Majesty, shouldn't we contact the police?" "I'm handling this through proper channels," James assured her, though he knew he was essentially operating alone. "Right now I need to catch them in the act to prove what's happening." At 7 o'clock, James positioned himself where he could observe both the kitchen and the route to the king's private dining room. He had arranged for 2 of his most trusted security officers to be nearby, though he hadn't yet explained the full situation to them. Exactly as predicted, Margaret Thornfield appeared in the kitchen at 7:15. James watched through security cameras as she approached Marie, carrying a small vial concealed in her hand. "I need to add the king's special medication to his tea," Margaret told Marie. "His Majesty's doctor prescribed it yesterday, but he's forgotten to take it regularly." Marie played her part perfectly, allowing Margaret to add the contents of the vial to the decoy tea service. The interaction was captured clearly on the security cameras, providing visual evidence of the poisoning attempt. Meanwhile, James personally delivered the real tea service to King Charles through a back corridor. His Majesty was surprised to see his security captain serving breakfast. "James, this is quite unusual. Is everything all right?" "Your Majesty, I need to speak with you urgently about a security matter," James said carefully. "I believe there may be an attempt to harm you this morning." King Charles set down his teacup, his expression growing serious. "What kind of attempt?" James took a deep breath and began explaining what he had discovered, starting with the overheard conversation and leading up to the morning's events. He showed the king the recordings he had made and the video of Margaret tampering with the tea. The monarch's face went through a range of emotions as he absorbed the information. Shock, disbelief, anger, and finally a deep sadness settled over his features. "My own wife," he said quietly. "I knew she had concerns about my approach to modernizing the monarchy, but this, Your Majesty, they're expecting you to fall ill within the next hour. We need to decide how to proceed." King Charles was quiet for several minutes, clearly struggling with the betrayal. Finally, he looked up at James with determination in his eyes. "We're going to let their plan proceed, but on our terms. I want to see exactly how far this conspiracy reaches." James was surprised by this response, but he understood the king's reasoning. By appearing to fall victim to the plot, they could identify all the conspirators and gather evidence of the full extent of the treachery. "What do you need me to do, Your Majesty?" "Help me appear genuinely ill. I'll complain of chest pains and shortness of breath. Call for medical assistance, but make sure it's our own royal physicians. Not anyone connected to this private clinic they've arranged." At 8:15, exactly when the conspirators expected the drug tea to take effect, King Charles began his performance. James called for emergency medical assistance, summoning Dr. Rebecca Thompson, the king's longtime personal physician, who was known to be completely trustworthy. When Dr. Thompson arrived, King Charles privately explained the situation to her. She was horrified but agreed to play along, conducting a genuine examination while appearing concerned about his condition. Queen Camilla arrived at the king's chambers within minutes of hearing about his apparent illness. James watched carefully as she performed her role as the concerned wife. "Oh, Charles, what happened?" "You looked fine last night," she said, though James noticed she didn't seem genuinely surprised by the development. "I started feeling chest pains about 20 minutes ago," the king replied, playing his part convincingly, "and I've been having trouble breathing." "We need to get you to a hospital immediately," Camilla said urgently. "I know of an excellent private facility that can provide discreet care." Dr. Thompson looked up from her examination. "I'd prefer to treat His Majesty here at the palace, where we can control the environment completely." No, Camilla insisted firmly. He needs specialized cardiac care. I've already contacted Harrington Private Health Services. They're expecting us. James exchanged glances with King Charles. This was exactly what they had predicted. Camilla was steering her husband toward the facility where the conspiracy would be completed. If you think that's best, darling, King Charles said weakly. Within an hour, a private ambulance arrived at Buckingham Palace. James insisted on accompanying the king as part of his security detail, despite Camilla's attempts to limit the number of people involved. During the drive to the clinic, James used a secure phone to contact Detective Inspector Sarah Walsh of the Metropolitan Police's Special Crimes Unit. He had worked with her before on security matters involving the royal family. Sarah, I need urgent assistance with a matter involving the crown. I can't explain over the phone, but I need you to meet me at Harrington Private Health Services with a full investigation team. James, that's a very serious request. Are you certain about this? I've never been more certain of anything in my life. The stability of the monarchy may depend on your response. At the clinic, King Charles was immediately taken to a private room, while James remained in the waiting area. He watched as Camilla spoke quietly with Dr. Harrison, the physician who was supposedly part of the conspiracy. Through a partially open door, James could hear Dr. Harrison speaking to the king. Your Majesty, I'm going to run some tests to determine the cause of your symptoms. We'll need blood work, stress tests, and a complete cardiac evaluation. King Charles played his role perfectly, appearing weak and compliant. Meanwhile, James knew that Detective Inspector Walsh and her team were positioning themselves around the clinic. The moment of truth came when Dr. Harrison emerged from the examination room with a grave expression. He approached Queen Camilla with a folder of test results that James knew had to be the fabricated documents they had prepared in advance. Your Majesty, Dr. Harrison said solemnly, I'm afraid the test results are quite serious. The king is experiencing significant cardiac stress that requires immediate intervention and complete rest. Camilla nodded gravely, but James could see the satisfaction in her eyes. What do you recommend, Doctor? I believe His Majesty should remain here under close supervision for an extended period. The stress of royal duties could be life-threatening in his current condition. This was the moment James had been waiting for. He stepped forward and spoke clearly so that the hidden recording devices he had planted could capture everything. Doctor, I find it interesting that you have test results ready so quickly, especially considering that His Majesty hasn't actually had his blood drawn yet. Dr. Harrison looked confused and alarmed. I'm sorry, who are you? Captain James Morrison, head of Royal Security, and I believe you're about to be arrested for conspiracy to commit fraud and assault. The clinic waiting room fell silent as Detective Inspector Walsh and her team entered through multiple entrances. Simultaneously, Dr. Harrison's face went white as he realized his carefully planned conspiracy was collapsing around him. Nobody move, Detective Inspector Walsh announced, displaying her warrant. This facility is now under police investigation for conspiracy, fraud, and attempted assault on a member of the royal family. Queen Camilla's mask of concern slipped for just a moment, revealing the calculating mind beneath. Officers, I demand to know what this is about. My husband is seriously ill and needs medical attention. Your Majesty, James said formally, I believe Detective Inspector Walsh would like to discuss some recordings we've obtained over the past 48 hours. King Charles chose this moment to emerge from the examination room, appearing remarkably healthy for someone who was supposedly suffering from cardiac crisis. The shock on Camilla's face was unmistakable. Charles, how are you? What's happening here? I'm feeling much better, darling, the king said with cold formality. Amazing how quickly one recovers when one hasn't actually been poisoned. Dr. Harrison attempted to leave quietly, but two officers blocked his path. Detective Inspector Walsh approached him with an evidence bag containing the vial that Margaret had used to tamper with the tea. Dr. Harrison, we have video evidence of your associate administering an unknown substance to the king's tea this morning. We also have recordings of conversations detailing plans to falsify medical records and hold His Majesty against his will. I don't know what you're talking about, Dr. Harrison stammered, but his voice lacked conviction. James stepped forward with a folder of documents. We also have copies of the fake test results you prepared in advance, Doctor. The ones showing cardiac markers that would justify keeping the king under sedation for months. Queen Camilla finally understood that her conspiracy had been completely exposed. Her shoulders sagged as the weight of her situation became clear. "How long have you known?" she asked King Charles quietly. "Since yesterday morning," he replied. "Captain Morrison overheard your planning session and spent the day gathering evidence. And you let me believe it was working?" "I needed to understand the full scope of your betrayal, Camilla. I needed to know everyone involved and see how far you were willing to go." Detective Inspector Walsh began making arrests. Dr. Harrison was charged with conspiracy to commit fraud and assault. Margaret Thornfield, who had been apprehended at the palace, faced similar charges along with the mysterious men who had been coordinating the medical and media aspects of the plot. But the question of what to do about Queen Camilla herself created a constitutional crisis unlike anything Britain had seen in centuries. As the king's wife and a member of the royal family, her case would require careful consideration of both legal and constitutional implications. "Your Majesty," Detective Inspector Walsh said to King Charles, "given the unique circumstances, we'll need guidance on how to proceed with Her Majesty the Queen Consort." King Charles looked older than his years as he considered the question. The personal betrayal was devastating, but the institutional implications were equally serious. "I need time to consider this matter properly," he said finally. "The Crown's response must be appropriate to both the crime and the constitutional principles involved." Back at Buckingham Palace, word of the conspiracy had begun to spread among senior staff. James found himself at the center of attention as the man who had saved the monarchy from an internal coup. Lord Chamberlain, Sir Andrew Parker, requested an immediate meeting with James to understand exactly what had transpired. "Captain Morrison, the implications of what you've uncovered are staggering," Sir Andrew said gravely. "A queen consort plotting against her own husband, the king, represents a crisis we haven't faced since medieval times." "Sir, I was simply doing my duty to protect His Majesty," James replied, though he understood the magnitude of what had been prevented. "You've done far more than your duty, Captain. You've potentially saved the constitutional monarchy itself." Meanwhile, in his private study, King Charles was meeting with his most trusted advisors to determine how to handle the situation. The Archbishop of Canterbury, the Prime Minister, and senior constitutional experts had been summoned for emergency consultations. The marriage itself was blessed by the Church and recognized by Parliament, the Archbishop noted gravely, but attempted removal of the sovereign through deception and force has no precedent in modern times. The Prime Minister looked equally troubled. "Your Majesty, from a legal standpoint, the Queen Consort has committed serious crimes, but the political implications of prosecuting her are enormous. What are my options?" King Charles asked wearily. "Legally, she could face charges ranging from conspiracy to treason," the constitutional expert explained. "Personally, you could seek annulment of the marriage on grounds of fraud and betrayal. Constitutionally, you could strip her of all royal titles and privileges. And the public reaction? That would depend entirely on how the situation is presented," the Prime Minister replied. "The British people have grown to accept Queen Camilla, but they also hold the crown itself in deep respect. If they understand that she threatened the stability of the monarchy, they might support strong action." King Charles spent hours weighing his options. The personal pain of his wife's betrayal was compounded by the need to make decisions that would affect the entire nation. That evening, he summoned James to his private chambers for a confidential conversation. "James, I owe you a debt that can never be repaid," the king began, "but I need your advice on something that goes beyond your official duties. I'm honored to help in any way I can. Your Majesty, the question isn't just what Camilla did, but what my response says about the monarchy itself. If I'm too lenient, it suggests the crown can be threatened from within. If I'm too harsh, it appears vindictive and could damage public sympathy." James considered this carefully before responding. "Your Majesty, perhaps the question isn't what's best for Queen Camilla or even what's best for you personally. The question is what's best for the institution you represent." "Explain." "The monarchy survives because people trust it to be above personal ambition and political scheming. Queen Camilla's actions threatened that trust. Your response needs to restore confidence that the crown will always prioritize duty over personal relationships." King Charles nodded slowly. "You're suggesting that the institution must take precedence over the individual. I'm suggesting that's what the British people expect from their monarch. Your Majesty, over the next several hours, King Charles made decisions that would reshape his life and the monarchy. He would address the nation directly, explaining what had happened and announcing his response. The speech would be unprecedented in royal history, but first he had one final conversation with Queen Camilla herself. Under police supervision, she was brought to a private room in the palace where her husband was waiting. "Why, Camilla?" he asked simply. "Why would you do this to me, to us, to the country?" Her response would determine not just her own fate, but how history would remember this extraordinary crisis in the British monarchy. Queen Camilla sat across from her husband in the palace's private family room, a space that had once been filled with warmth and intimate conversations. Now it felt like a courtroom where their marriage was on trial. "I did it because I love this institution more than you do," Camilla said defiantly, her composure finally cracking. "Charles, you were destroying everything the monarchy represents. All your talk about modernization, cutting back on ceremonies, reducing the royal footprint. The people don't want efficiency from their royals. They want magic, tradition, grandeur." King Charles studied his wife's face, searching for any sign of remorse. "So you decided to drug me and have me declared incompetent?" "I decided to save the crown from your progressive nonsense," she replied sharply. "You've been king for less than 2 years and you're already talking about changes that took centuries to establish. The public ceremonies, the state occasions, the sense of royal mystery. These aren't outdated traditions, Charles. They're the foundation of our relevance. And you believed you could lead better than I could?" Camilla's eyes flashed with conviction. "I know I could. I've spent decades rebuilding my reputation, learning what the people want from their royals. They want someone who understands that the monarchy isn't just about duty and service. It's about providing a sense of continuity, stability, and yes, glamour in an uncertain world." King Charles felt a deep sadness settle over him. His wife wasn't just ambitious. She genuinely believed her vision for the monarchy was superior to his own. "Camilla, you attempted to overthrow the crown through medical fraud and conspiracy. How is that serving the institution?" "Sometimes extraordinary measures are necessary to preserve something precious," she replied without hesitation. "If I had succeeded, history would have judged the results, not the methods." Detective Inspector Walsh, who had been observing silently, stepped forward. "Your Majesty, we need to discuss the formal charges." King Charles held up his hand. "Give us a few more minutes, please." After the detective withdrew, Charles leaned forward toward his wife. "Camilla, do you understand what you've done to us? To our marriage? To the trust the nation placed in both of us?" For the first time, Camilla's confident facade wavered. I hoped you would eventually understand that I was trying to help. By removing me from power through deception and potentially dangerous drugs?" "The medication wasn't dangerous," she said defensively. "Dr. Harrison assured me it would only create temporary symptoms. But you were prepared to keep me sedated for months while you consolidated power." Camilla looked away, unable to meet his eyes. "Power was never the goal, Charles. Protecting the monarchy was the goal." "Power was absolutely the goal," King Charles replied firmly. "And you were willing to betray your marriage vows, your oath to the crown, and your duty to the nation to achieve it." The conversation was interrupted by a knock on the door. James Morrison entered with urgent news. "Your Majesty, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's been a development. The media has gotten wind of the story. We have reporters gathering outside the palace, and social media is starting to buzz with rumors about the Queen's arrest." King Charles realized that time for private deliberation was over. The crisis was about to become public, and he needed to get ahead of the narrative. "James, arrange for a television address to the nation for this evening. Contact the BBC and other major networks." "Yes, Your Majesty." "What should we tell the press in the meantime?" "Nothing yet. But prepare a statement confirming that I am in good health and that there will be an important announcement tonight." After James left, King Charles turned back to his wife. "Camilla, in a few hours I'm going to tell the British people what you attempted to do. Before I make that speech, I need to know, do you have any remorse for your actions?" Camilla was quiet for a long moment before answering. "I regret that my methods caused you pain, Charles. But I don't regret trying to save the monarchy from what I believed were misguided reforms. That's not the same as remorse." "No," she admitted. "It's not." King Charles stood up, his decision crystallizing. "Then you've made my choice easier." That afternoon, the palace buzzed with activity as preparations were made for the most significant royal address in decades. Constitutional experts worked frantically to ensure that whatever the king announced would be legally sound and constitutionally appropriate. James Morrison found himself in the unusual position of briefing senior government officials about the conspiracy he had uncovered. The Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, and the Attorney General needed to understand the full scope of what had happened before the King's speech. Captain Morrison, the Attorney General said after hearing the complete account, "Your evidence gathering has been exemplary. The recordings, video surveillance, and physical evidence provide an airtight case against all the conspirators." "What about the Queen Consort herself?" the Home Secretary asked. "That decision rests with His Majesty," the Attorney General replied. "But legally, she could face charges ranging from conspiracy to attempted assault on the sovereign." Meanwhile, King Charles was working with his speechwriters to craft an address that would explain the situation to the nation without causing a constitutional crisis. The speech needed to be clear about what had happened while maintaining public confidence in the monarchy itself. At 6 o'clock that evening, television networks across Britain and the Commonwealth interrupted regular programming for a special announcement from Buckingham Palace. King Charles appeared behind his desk in his private study, looking tired but resolute. "My subjects in Britain and throughout the Commonwealth," he began, "I speak to you tonight about events that have shaken the very foundation of our constitutional monarchy." The king explained how Captain Morrison had uncovered a conspiracy to remove him from power through medical fraud. He detailed the plot without sensationalizing it, presenting the facts in a way that emphasized the threat to constitutional order rather than personal betrayal. The individual who led this conspiracy held a position of ultimate trust within the royal family, the king continued, his voice steady despite the emotional difficulty of his words. "Queen Camilla, my wife, believed that she could better serve the crown by removing me from my duties through deception and fabricated medical evidence." The revelation sent shockwaves through the viewing audience. Social media exploded with reactions ranging from disbelief to outrage to sympathy for the king's personal situation. "I want to be absolutely clear," King Charles continued, "that I am in excellent health. The symptoms of illness that were reported were artificially induced through medication secretly administered this morning. The medical crisis was entirely fabricated." He then announced his decision regarding Queen Camilla's fate, a choice that would define his reign and the future of the British monarchy. Effective immediately, I am stripping Camilla Parker Bowles of all royal titles, privileges, and positions. She will no longer be known as Queen Consort or hold any official role within the royal family. Our marriage is being dissolved through special ecclesiastical and legal procedures due to the fundamental breach of trust her actions represent. The king's voice grew stronger as he concluded his historic address. "The crown must always be above personal ambition and political scheming. Those who would threaten our constitutional order from within cannot be permitted to remain in positions of trust and authority." Captain James Morrison of the Royal Guard exemplified the loyalty and duty that protects our democratic institutions. His courage in exposing this conspiracy has preserved the stability of the crown for future generations. As the speech ended, Britain and the world struggled to absorb the magnitude of what had been revealed. A queen had attempted to overthrow her own husband, and a simple palace guard had saved the monarchy from an internal coup. The aftermath of King Charles's shocking address rippled across Britain and the Commonwealth like an earthquake. Within hours of the broadcast, Buckingham Palace was surrounded by crowds of supporters expressing their loyalty to the monarch and their outrage at the conspiracy that had nearly succeeded James. Morrison watched the crowds from his office window, still struggling to believe that his routine morning patrol just days earlier had led to uncovering the most significant royal conspiracy in modern history. His secure phone rang constantly with calls from government officials, foreign security services, and media outlets seeking additional details about the investigation. Detective Inspector Walsh briefed him on the expanding criminal investigation. "James, we've arrested 12 people so far, including Margaret Thornfield, Dr. Harrison, and several others who were involved in planning the medical fraud. The evidence you gathered has been absolutely crucial." "What about the former Queen Consort?" James asked. "That's more complicated. She's being held under house arrest at a secure location, while lawyers determine the exact charges. Attempting to overthrow a monarch, even through deception, could technically constitute treason. The legal complexities were unprecedented. Britain hadn't faced the prospect of trying a queen for treason since the medieval period. Constitutional scholars worked around the clock to determine the appropriate legal framework for prosecuting someone who had held such a unique position. Meanwhile, the public reaction was swift and decisive. Opinion polls showed overwhelming support for King Charles's handling of the crisis. The British people admired his courage in exposing his wife's betrayal and his willingness to put constitutional duty above personal loyalty. His Majesty showed exactly the kind of leadership we need, said one person interviewed outside Buckingham Palace. He put the country before his own feelings. International reaction was equally supportive. Leaders from across the Commonwealth praised King Charles for protecting democratic institutions and maintaining the stability that the monarchy represented. 3 days after the televised address, King Charles summoned James Morrison for a private meeting in his study. The king looked tired but more at peace than he had since the crisis began. "James, I've been meeting with government officials about your role in this affair," the king began. "The Prime Minister, the Home Secretary, and the head of MI5 all agree that your actions went far beyond normal security duties. I was simply protecting your Majesty, as I swore to do. You were protecting the crown itself, James. Without your vigilance and courage, this conspiracy might have succeeded. The constitutional implications would have been catastrophic." King Charles stood and walked to his desk, retrieving an ornate document. "I'm promoting you to head of Royal Protection, with a rank equivalent to Assistant Commissioner in the Metropolitan Police. You'll also be receiving the Royal Victorian Order, Knight Commander class for exceptional service to the Crown." James was speechless. The Royal Victorian Order was one of the highest honors the monarch could bestow, reserved for those who had provided extraordinary personal service to the royal family. "Your Majesty, I'm deeply honored, but I was only doing my job." "James, you did far more than your job. You made decisions that preserved the constitutional monarchy for future generations. History will remember what you did." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Sir Andrew Parker, the Lord Chamberlain, who brought updates on the ongoing legal proceedings. "Your Majesty, the Attorney General has finalized the charges against the former Queen Consort. She'll face conspiracy to commit fraud, conspiracy to assault the sovereign, and conspiracy to undermine constitutional government. The treason charges were deemed too complex given the unique circumstances. And the others? Dr. Harrison and Margaret Thornfield will face the most serious charges. The others involved in the conspiracy will receive lesser charges based on their level of participation." King Charles nodded grimly. "I want to ensure that justice is served, but I also want to move forward in a way that heals rather than divides the nation." Over the following weeks, the criminal trials proceeded with unprecedented media attention. The evidence that James had gathered proved overwhelming, and guilty verdicts were returned against all the major conspirators. Dr. Harrison received a prison sentence of 8 years, while Margaret Thornfield was sentenced to 6 years. The case against Camilla Parker Bowles, as she was now known, was more complex. Her lawyers argued that her actions, while misguided, were motivated by genuine concern for the monarchy rather than personal ambition. However, the prosecution's evidence of detailed planning and willingness to drug the king convinced the jury that her motivations were irrelevant to the serious nature of her crimes. She was sentenced to 5 years in prison, though legal experts expected she would serve only half, that time in a minimum security facility appropriate for someone of her former status. The trial revelations provided additional details about the scope of the conspiracy. Evidence showed that Camilla had been planning her move for over 6 months, carefully recruiting accomplices and preparing false documents. She had genuinely believed that her vision for the monarchy was superior to her husband's modernizing approach. Throughout this period, King Charles demonstrated remarkable resilience and leadership. Rather than withdrawing from public duties during the crisis, he increased his engagement with the British people, making clear that the monarchy remained strong and stable despite the internal threat it had faced. 6 months after the conspiracy was exposed, King Charles held a special ceremony at Buckingham Palace to honor James Morrison and the other security personnel who had helped protect the crown. The ceremony was broadcast live, symbolizing the transparency and accountability that the king wanted to bring to his reign. "Captain Morrison," the king said during the ceremony, represents the very best of British service and loyalty. When faced with an unprecedented threat to our constitutional order, he chose duty over personal safety, truth over convenience, and the national interest over his own comfort. As James knelt to receive his knighthood, he reflected on the extraordinary journey that had brought him to this moment. A simple security patrol had led to uncovering a conspiracy that could have changed the course of British history. The king's final words during the ceremony captured the broader significance of what had transpired. This crisis has reminded us that democratic institutions, including constitutional monarchy, are only as strong as the people who serve them faithfully. When those institutions are threatened, it is often ordinary citizens performing extraordinary acts of courage who preserve them for future generations. In the months that followed, Sir James Morrison settled into his new role as head of royal protection, implementing enhanced security protocols designed to prevent future internal threats to the monarchy. His story became part of royal history, studied by security professionals and constitutional scholars as an example of how vigilance and courage could protect democratic institutions. King Charles's handling of the crisis strengthened public confidence in the monarchy and established his reputation as a leader willing to make difficult decisions for the greater good. His modernizing reforms continued, but with greater public support as people recognized his commitment to serving the nation above all personal considerations. The conspiracy that had threatened to destroy the constitutional monarchy from within ultimately strengthened it, proving that the crown could survive even the most intimate betrayals when its guardians remained faithful to their duties. James Morrison had saved more than just a king. He had preserved an institution that represented centuries of British history and tradition. Years later, when asked about his role in the affair, Sir James would say simply, "I took an oath to protect the crown, and that's what I did. The crown belongs to the British people, not to any individual, and it was my honor to ensure it remained in their service." The Royal Guard had indeed exposed the hidden plot, and his next move had not just stunned the palace but preserved the very foundation of the British constitutional system for generations to come.